My name is Frank Badovic, and I'm here with Ralph Arnold. The date is Sunday, October 15th, 2017, and our location is the main branch of the Westminster Library, of the Carroll County Library in Westminster, I should say. And we're going to be talking about the history of St. John's Church. And Ralph has been a longtime parishioner. He spent his whole life being a supportive school board member, an alumni, and he established the Nellie Arnold Endowment Fund for Catholic Education that provides tuition assistance to kids whose families can't afford to go to St. John's. So that's much appreciated by a lot of people, Ralph, and we thank you for that.
Quite welcome.
Ralph, St. John celebrated its 150th anniversary in 2003, yet the history of the Catholic community goes back much farther than that. Why was Westminster, which was probably settled by English Protestants, singled out for a Catholic presence and given a priest way back when in 1853?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fair enough. Right. Where do you think people went for just to hear and hear Mass back then, because the church wasn't built yet?
Yeah, people had to have been going to Mass in their homes and doing things like that, community centers.
So the priest from Tawnytown probably came here.
Yep.
And said Mass for people that way.
For
okay.
sure.
Fair enough. Do you have any stories about the church back in the 1840s and 50s where there was a great amount of anti-Catholic sentiment in this area?
No, I do not.
Okay, just curious.
Not quite that old.
The church was central to the town after it was built, and the town, of course, was much more compact back then. It must have been central to your life. What are your fondest thoughts and memories about the old church?
Well, I guess, I grew up in Westminster from the time I was about 8 years old. I lived out on Carroll Street. So Carroll Street's about 3 or 4 blocks from where the church is. And of course, I went to the school, first grade through the 12th grade. And the school actually is the big connection for me with the parish, with the church. And living on Carroll Street, you would walk down to school each day, and on Sundays you'd walk here for Mass. So I kind of, and you're right, Main Street was very connected in those days. This was before Westminster, the first shopping center in Westminster. So we, but at any event, Main Street was very compact, and you had, and then lots of folks walked to school. Mrs. Matthias would bring her kids down. She came from East Main Street. Mrs. McCaffrey would bring her kids from West Main Street. And I used to be, once I was in the 3rd grade, I was like considered a leader. So I would have a bunch of kids that would come from Carroll Street and Milton Avenue, and they would walk with me so that they got down to school safely. And the TB&H trucks didn't run them down at John Street, because that's where they came out. So, but those are fond memories. Some kind of like scary memories, not really scary, but being a little kid, when you go in that old church, and the church was dark. It's not as well lit as churches are today. And the first time you go in there to make confession, I mean, you go behind that velvet robe, and the priest has got that little dark window, and so that was like a scary moment for me. But and that was an early memory of the church. I guess I received my first confession when I was in the 2nd grade. So good memories is it was always alive when we would go to Mass on Christmas. You'd have the choir, you'd have 30 or 40 altar boys, from the young ones all the way up to the ones who were in high school. So that was, and of course you're always excited at Christmas anyway, but it was fun going there for Christmas Masses, and it was usually decorated very nice. So those are good memories.
Was there an architectural feature of the church that really stands out to you in your own mind?
Well, not so much. Well, architectural, I think it's the buttressing system. If you look at the ceiling, the way it was brought together, that was, when you're a little kid and you're looking way up like that was pretty neat. The organ always stood out because it was up on the 2nd deck back there, and Charlie Swinderman was the organist when I was there as a kid, he was the organist for like 60, 70, I don't know exactly how many years, but a long time for the parish. So that, things that are not part of the architecture, but the Stations of the Cross. They were always beautiful, looking at those around the church. And as I've gotten older, I've learned to appreciate them more because they all dated back to the 1850s. So,
Right. You mentioned the school earlier.
Yeah.
You were taught by what order of nuns?
School Sisters of Notre Dame.
Okay. And do you have any special memories of the faculty at that time? Any one sister stand out, or are there any special memories of the classes you took?
Well, I can tell you a little bit. Sister Miriam Louise was my first grade teacher. And in those days we had, and this was, we were baby boomer kids, so we had big classes. There was 50 of us in the first grade, and we had half of the second grade. And Sister Miriam Louise handled all 70-some kids that were in the, which is amazing. So, and she didn't carry a roller like some of the nuns did, but she was kind nun, and she really, what I remember most about her is she gave me kind of like a zest for reading. She taught me how to read. And then Mrs. Henshaw, so we started migrating from nuns in middle school. She taught me in the 4th grade, and she's the one who, she always would talk about you can create the world, you can do whatever you want to do through reading. And she's the one that got me into reading and enjoying it, and it's the foundation for my life. You can't do much without reading. So she was probably my favorite lay teacher. Sister Miriam Louise was, I would say, my favorite elementary teacher. Let's see, I went to school on Main Street for 6 years. After that, I went out to Monroe Street. So Sister Maria, my second grade teacher, was also very good. She, I guess, I had some, I don't know if I had learning disabilities, but I can remember when she says, "Arnold, I don't understand why you can't understand what I'm telling you." And she would beat on me a little bit. And later on, she came back here in 1998 because we were celebrating 100 years of the School Sisters of Notre Dame at that time. And she said, and she was going to be my 5th grade teacher. She did 2nd, she was going to be the 5th grade teacher, but they moved her to another assignment. So, but I was looking forward to getting back with her.
Yeah.
Early years, 1st and 2nd grade. In the 1st grade, all 12 grades were right here on Main Street, my 1st grade year. And what was neat, in May of each year, we did it for 2 years in the old school, we would go upstairs, the auditorium was on the 2nd floor, and the high school would put on whatever play they were doing for that year. So I can remember Steve Baraxis, he's an attorney here in Westminster now. He is about 10 years older than me, but he was usually a star in those plays. So I think one of them was like Heaven Can Wait. So he died, and then they brought him back, and he was walking through. Well, how did I die? Who killed me? So, but those were fine memories. Thinking about the plays. We used to have we had a Christmas bazaar up there. Before we moved out to Monroe Street, up on that 2nd floor, and I can remember going there and all the goodies, the cakes and the fudge and treats and things like that. So that was always a fun time in the school. So.
Now the school is not too far from the cemetery. Any memories of the cemetery, or is there something you can tell me about the cemetery itself?
Well, the cemetery dates back to before, actually I think before the original church was built. And what I remember about the cemetery is at the end of the cemetery used to be the convent. So up in the corner of Green Street and the alley there. So if you tried to get into favor with the nuns, you would usually walk up through the cemetery and greet them and help them bring their bags down to the school in the morning. So that was, I used to like doing that. But other than that, the Shrivers have some big statues in the in the cemetery. So it's a good.
Earlier you mentioned the Stations of the Cross. There's a story about them. They were in the old church. They came from Germany.
Yeah.
And they ended up in the new church. So what's the story about that?
Okay. The story is this: there's a family, Mr. and Mrs. Crone. They had a farm, I think, out in the Tawnytown area, and the pastor at the time really wasn't going to preserve them. So Mr. Crone said, "I'll take them." So he hung them up in his barn. So he took them. It would have been in the late '60s, probably 1969. He passed away probably. I mean, he lived into the early 2000s, or late 1990s, I should say. And and I don't know who discovered that they were still up in his barn. I don't know if it was one of his children or not. When we were building the new church, we were trying to get as much history as we could from the old church. And someone said, well, the Crones, those are still up in the Crones barn, the Stations of the Cross. And then we had a young lady restore them, and they're in the new church, the one that was built in 2003.
And the stained glass windows?
Stained glass windows, same thing. I don't know where they were stored, but we've got 10 of the stained glass windows from the original church. Mm-hmm. So it's really, it's interesting that we were able to preserve it, because we were tearing down that old church in 1969, and we didn't move into that new church until 2003. So we were bound to keep that history with us. So, and both of those are, date back to the 1850s.
What feelings did you have when you saw that old church being torn down?
Well, I was in high school at the time, and I felt sad that we were tearing it down, and we didn't know where we were going to go to church. We ended up going up to McDaniel, but we also did a lot of masses right in our gym, which is in the high school. So we would bring out the chairs and everything for mass and put them away so we could play basketball later in the day. But I've been a high school kid. When I think back now, I feel bad that we don't have that old church, and I have a greater appreciation for history. But at 17, it was like, okay, church is going down. We're going to find a new church somewhere. Yes. So what affected me more was the fact that right after the same year that the church was torn down, we closed the high school. So I graduated in 1969. So I was part of the last graduating class of St. John's while we had a full high school. So the juniors at the time, they ended up completing their senior year. There was 14 of them all by themselves in what is now the Parish Center. They were in the basement of that. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, previous to the decision that the church had to be torn down because of structural damage as a result of vibrations from the train,
yep.
You lost your steeple.
Yeah.
Can you recall that?
Well, I was 2 or 1.5, I think, when the steeple went down. But I heard the stories. I knew that it came down. It wiped out the existing rectory, we built a new rectory a year after that. That new rectory is now part of this library.
How'd that make you feel when they took they repurposed the land for the library?
Well, what was interesting is in that old rectory, we had a chapel in the basement, and my wife and I were married there. So I kind of thought, well, my high school was gone, so the chapel where we were married, that's gone. So it was kind of like, okay, we need to start fresh here. So, so I try to be flexible with things like that. So,
How has the congregation of St. John's changed over the years since you were a young kid?
Okay. When I was a kid, we probably had about 400, 500 parishioners. During the late 70s through the late 90s, this county's population just took off. And we got up to probably about 3,500 parishioners. Now we've contracted a little bit, but we got to 3,500 by the early 2000s or so. So we were just growing like crazy. So, the old church, one on Main Street, we used for 100 years. The new church, which is now the portico, we moved into in 72 and out in 2003. So we used that for about 30 years. So the new church is up there now. It's built for like 1,100 people at a sitting. So I think it's more. It'll be like the old church. It'll accommodate us for a century. So.
When they built the church off of 140 after they tore down the old church, it obviously was a different design than you were accustomed to. What was your reaction to it? It was very contemporary.
Yeah, well, my reaction, even though I was in my early 20s at the time, I did not like the contemporary design. But we were in the 70s, and people were, doing different things and different designs. So I don't think I was in the group who was working on it. They liked it, but I don't know how many other parishioners liked it. But I like the traditional church, and I think that message was heard because the new church is much more traditional.
Yeah. So. Do you have any special memories about Father Joe or Father Art that you'd like to pass on?
Yeah. Well, Father Joe, he was pastor he's about 20 years, and I was on the pastoral council. I was president of it for, I guess, the 3 of the years that he was here, and I liked him. I'm a bean counter by trade, so he was all business. So I really, so I appreciated that, working with him, and he had a good common sense approach for getting things done. But one of the times that I remember, we had a seminarian who was just ordained as a priest, and he was saying his first Mass up in New Jersey somewhere. And a group of us went up, and Father Joe went with us, and it was, it was like, priests, they're like on a pedestal above us, but he was really personal. And that was this was in probably the mid-70s, and priests at that time were a little tougher, more stone-faced, and I realized, okay, these guys are guys, and he's just like I am. He's a human person, so that's a fond memory of him. Monsignor Art, there's, I don't know, so many fond memories. He was very dynamic, different from Father Joe. Everybody loved him. I got to spend time with him right before he passed away.
Mm-hmm. He was definitely a very, very special person. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. What's your take on the future of St. John and the Catholic community here in Westminster?
Well, my take is, well, one, we've got a very dynamic pastor now, Father Mark, and he wants St. John's to be as big a part of the community as we've been in the past, and to be an even bigger part going forward. So I see that we've been declining as a parish which I don't think is unusual for Catholic parishes. Been declining the last 15 years or so. And I see that he's going to work and help grow the parish. And we got a lot of young parishioners and old parishioners like me that want to do that, make a new face for the church, and really be involved in the community. My goal, the reason I established that scholarship fund you mentioned, is to help kids afford a good Catholic education. When I went to school here, and this will knock your socks off, the tuition was $25 a year, and it never changed, first grade through the 8th grade. High school, they doubled it to $50. But my endowment was the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and we don't have that today. So it's a way to give back so the kids who normally wouldn't be attending a Catholic school can do it. Mm-hmm. So my goal was and I'll be part of that outreach with the church to get more kids, to get more people into the pews, grow our school back to where it used to be.
That's a noble goal. Is there anything you'd like to say that you haven't said yet about the history of St. John?
I don't know. I'll tell you, the history is entwined with my life. So I've been parishioner since I was 3. One interesting note, I don't that if this you'll cut this out or not, but my mother was from the Church of the Brethren. So when they got married, I wasn't baptized till I was 3. She died when I was 3. My grandmother, scholarship is named after her. She said to my dad, and I have a brother, who's 18 months at that time, if these boys have to be baptized, or they're not coming in, because he moved back home with her. So that's a story. And when I received my first communion, the nun said, well, we can't find your baptismal certificate. And I said, well, I'm 6. I was probably baptized when I was 6 months or whatever. And they found it, and I found out years later that, well, you weren't baptized till you were 3. So, but in that old church. So, but it kind of brought things together, because I kind of remembered being in the church and having water poured on my head, and I knew that if I was 6, 7 months, I would never have remembered that. But that's a story. I don't know if that fits in there or not, but you got that story.
Very good. Ralph Arnold, thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank. Appreciate it.